That means the Amos Fortune Forum is now in session. My name is Brad Smith. I want to welcome all of you to tonight's presentation. This is the second week of our summer series. This is the 77th year that the Amos Fortune Forum has been meeting in this beautiful building. It's really nice to be here tonight with all of you. I have just a few announcements, but they're very important because they're thank yous, and then I will move things on to the main event. I first want to thank both Romana Lee and Bruce Bartles. They are on the Amos Fortune Forum Committee, and they have graciously hosted our guest of honor tonight, and also sponsored the beautiful flowers you see here from Calls down in Jaffrey. So thank you very much, both of you. I also want to thank Susan Sarles for organizing the reception that we will have immediately after the presentation this evening. You are all invited. Right after we conclude tonight, you can follow the lights right over across the way, and there'll be some nice cold refreshments, which I'm sure will be nice after an hour here in the meeting house. As much as we love it, it gets warm in here. So please do join us. I also want to thank all of our corporate sponsors and the many individuals who have contributed to the forum this year and over the years. As you know, it is free and open to all, and we want to keep it that way, and that is our commitment. So thank you to all of them and to all of you. If you haven't contributed, we give you ample opportunities to do so. There are begging bowls that you'll see on the way out. And I would also invite you to go to our website, which has a new address. It's amosfortune.org. You can learn more about the forum. You can learn about our speakers, the upcoming presentations that we'll have this year. We also have listed every speaker in the 77 years, and it's really interesting to go through and see who has been here and spoken on this very stage. Lastly, we are recording this event and each event, and hopefully by the end of the weekend, it will be posted up on YouTube. So if you have friends or family who either couldn't make it tonight or live out of region, you'll be able to let them know that they can watch the entire presentation at their leisure. So with that, I will now turn it over to Romana Lee, who will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Oh, I can stand up. Hi. Well, thank you for coming. And it is truly my pleasure to introduce you to one of my closest friends from Washington, D.C., Annette Polan. Annette is a world-renowned artist who has painted leaders of industry and government. Her work, a testament of her talent and dedication, is proudly displayed at the D.C. National Portrait Gallery, in museums and private collections across the U.S. and notably at the Supreme Court. A professor emeritus at the Corcoran College of Art and Design at George Washington University, Annette brings a wealth of knowledge, passion, experience to the art world. She taught and lectured in Europe, Asia, and Australia. She was chair and founder of Faces of the Fallen, which was incredible. I was there with her. An exhibition of, it was her idea. She got it through. An exhibition of 1,323 portraits by 230 American Artists, recruited by Annette, honoring the American servicemen and women who died in Afghanistan and Iraq. In recognition of her leadership, the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff awarded her the Outstanding Public Service Award. So please welcome my dear friend, Annette, who came all this way to speak to you. Thank you.
First, I want to thank Romana and Bruce for inviting me up here and hosting me this whole weekend. I am in love with this area of the country. It's so, even in this heat, beautiful, just beautiful. And I'm so honored to be part of the forum that's been going on for 77 years. That's fantastic. I am not a legal scholar. I'm not an expert on the Supreme Court or even an expert on Sandra Day O'Connor. I'm here to tell you some of my experiences with the justice before and after I painted her portrait. 3 days after joining the court in September 1981, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor hired a fitness instructor and invited the women in her chambers and few from the neighborhood to participate in an exercise class that met at 8 o'clock in the morning in the gym on the top floor of the Supreme Court building. 4 days a week, they did aerobics. On Fridays, it was yoga. Invited by a Capitol Hill neighbor, I joined the group in the mid-1980s and rarely missed a class. Not even when I was diagnosed and then underwent treatment for breast cancer. When you sweat with somebody 5 days a week for years, you get to know them. You get to know them very well. And eventually you become friends. Although with most friends, you don't have to transition from calling them Justice to using their actual first name. It was my good fortune that we also became collaborators when she asked me to paint her portrait. 9 years after joining the court, at the age of 60, Justice O'Connor decided that she'd prefer to be memorialized before she got any older and before her looks changed. She was very practical. I started every portrait by photographing my subject, and this one was no exception. She chose the chair she used on the bench, and I photographed her in her chambers. After making multiple sketches of different poses and different expressions, I invited the Justice and her husband, John, to select one image that I would turn into a portrait. Then I carefully composed the painting and the colors. I wanted the painting to be strong and filled with meaning. I wanted to ensure that she appear both dignified and feminine. I wanted people to really get to know something about her from looking at this portrait. And I also wanted it to fit in with all the male justices that line the corridors of the Supreme Court. Justice O'Connor was both a right brain and a left brain dominant person. She was analytical and logical while also being creative and intuitive. So I chose to convey this by focusing light on her in two directions. You can see this from the shadows and also from the highlights on her face. I created the composition to convey her strength along with her warmth. The softness in her that coexisted with a sharpness. Her Western heritage commingled with the symbolism of her place in our nation's history. Her right hand, wearing a family ring that contained a turquoise mined on their family farm, is poised above the arm of the chair. There's slight tension in the gesture. She's smiling slightly, but not grinning like an imbecile. Her hair is coiffed, but in a very classical style, nothing trendy. She's dressed in a soft, fawn-colored skirt and blouse with a feminine bow. After I started painting, I sort of lowered her hemline a little, just add a little more paint. I wanted her legs to show, but not too much of her legs. I underpainted the black robe with red to give a warmth to the black. And I used a rich, deep cadmium red medium for the leather in the chair that she sits in. The background is typical of the white marble that the whole Supreme Court is built out of. It's everywhere. The eagle on the table next to her was a gift from Native Americans from Arizona who visited her in her chambers. The book on the table is the Bible she used when she took the oath of office. Everything in the image has meaning and influences the way you see her, the first woman who was appointed Associate Justice in the Supreme Court of America. As the portrait evolved, she talked. She talked a lot, and I listened. But I did more than paint. Over the 9 months that it took to complete her portrait, I listened and I learned. I learned a lot about her. I learned about her approach to life. And I learned that there are always lessons buried in her stories. So I listened even more intently. Sandra O'Connor was pragmatic. And while I would love to think that she chose me to paint the portrait because I was the best portrait painter in the United States at the time, the truth is different. She did want a woman to paint her portrait. She knew me and she liked both me and my work. But most importantly, my Capitol Hill studio was conveniently located near the court. So sitting would be easier to fit into her schedule. I also learned that for her, family came first and hard work was everything. Sandra wasn't a sentimental person, except when it came to her family and the Lazy Bee Ranch. That her grandfather first settled in the high desert country south of the Gila River, just on the border of Arizona and New Mexico. He settled there in 1880. When she talked about the ranch, my artist's brain would automatically begin painting a picture in my mind's eye. The land was dry. It was incredibly dry. The average rainfall in this part of the United States is 10 inches or less a year. The south and west of this vast territory were semi-arid masses rung by volcanic hills littered with boulders and rocks of basalt. The river to the north is barely a trickle most of the year. American Indians had been making camps around here for thousands of years. The desert was full of mountain lions, fox, and coyotes, as well as Gila monsters, tarantulas, scorpions, and snakes. But there weren't many people when Sandra was growing up. Over the years, the Lazy Bee became the largest ranch in the whole area, 160,000 acres. There were some 2,000 cattle, their calves, a few bulls, and some horses, including her beloved Chico. They all grazed there. When I first pictured it, the Lazy Bee seemed intimidatingly grand. And it was huge, but it was also primitive. Now, this is a justice sitting on the Supreme Court. It was 36 miles from the closest town. It was totally secluded. And in her early childhood, there was no electricity, no running water, and only outdoor toilets and kerosene lanterns. A generator produced a little electricity for a few hours in the evening. She was 6 or 7 before the whole ranch became electrified. When she was 9, her brother Alan was born, and her sister Anne came a few years later. Although the family was very close, given the age difference between Sandra and her siblings, her first cousin Flournoy felt like a sister to her. And the only time I ever saw Sandra really emotional, she started crying one day when we were getting dressed after exercise class. Flournoy had just died, and she just sobbed. From her father, Harry Day, she developed a great love of the land and also acquired a passion for debating politics. Mostly politics, ranching politics and economics, but also current news that she read with her parents in daily newspapers and weekly magazines at the table. Every night they had these passionate discussions. Her trait of wanting to have the last word came from imitating her father in those discussions. Her mother, Ada Mae, was a dignified, elegant, well-educated woman who was always well-dressed, even though she lived in these primitive environment. Ada Mae taught Sandra to read when Sandra was only 4 years old. She had this sense of confidence and charm that helped her fit in to any group that she happened to be part of, be it the wilds of Arizona or a public reception in Washington, D.C. Sandra was like that too. In spite of all the honors and awards she received during her years in Washington, she told me that her greatest honor was being inducted into the Cowgirl Hall of Fame. Her mother and her grandmother taught her how to navigate the ranch's male culture. And even though I never met them, I recognized parts of them in the way Sandra interacted with her 8 male colleagues on the bench. She was always well-dressed and exceptionally well-prepared. She was demanding and exacting, but never punishing. Sandra's parents eloped and were married by a justice of the peace before they moved to the Lazy Bee. There, they shared quarters with the cowboys, who slept on a screened-in porch. Life was definitely hard, but the Days remained very much in love. Their whole married like 50 years. Sandra and John had that same kind of marriage. They were devoted to each other until John's death in 2009. Growing up, Sandra loved riding the range and herding cattle with the cowboys. Most of them were rough and uneducated eccentrics. Some of them drank too much. Some of them gambled too much. But they were all hardworking men. They were Sandra's babysitters. They adored her, and she loved them. They taught her by example. There are no excuses, only results. You get the work done or you don't. She was totally at home in this all-male domain. Looking back, Sandra said her early days on the ranch was probably the first initiation into an all-male club, something that she did more than once. Sandra had a passion about education. As much as she loved ranch life and living there, she moved in with her maternal grandparents and her cousin Flournoy each fall from the time she was 6 years old and going into first grade through high school, because there really was no opportunity around the ranch. It was so big. There were no schools around there. But she loved going back to the Lazy Bee and becoming a cowgirl again during her school vacations and summer break. Sandra was only 16 when she started Stanford University in 1946. She was a freshman then. She was smart. Inspired by a class she took her junior year that was taught by a Stanford law professor, she convinced the university to let her skip her senior year and go straight into law school as a first-year law student. She was one of 5 women in the class of 112 people. Unintimidated by her classmates and inspired by her study of the law, by the time she graduated, she was induced into the Order of the Coif, which is a prestigious national honor society, and served on the Stanford Law Review Board, editorial board. Being part of the law review gave Sandra more than just superior research, writing, and editing skills. It was also there, on the law review that she met and fell in love with John O'Connor. Born in San Francisco, John knew nothing about ranch life, but he went home to the ranch with her for spring break during just their second year. Like her parents, Sandra and John's relationship developed quickly, and this trip to Arizona was to formally introduce him to her family. The trip proved that John was made of tough stuff. Sandra told me the story of taking John around the ranch while they were castrating and branding the calves. This is not pretty. To test his nerve, Sandra's father reached into this dirty, bloody bucket and pulled out a bloody testicle. They called it mountain oyster. Her father stuck one of these on a wire skewer and stuck it into the fire that they were using for branding. And then he turns to John and he says, this sizzling, disgusting delicacy, just to see if he would have the nerve to take it. And to his credit, John popped the whole thing in his mouth, swallowed it whole, and smiled. That and his sense of humor won everybody in the family over. Sandra taught me about rugged determination and the importance of resilience. Even though she graduated third in her class from law school, no law firm would hire her. That was 1962. This happened to lots of women. I mean, there weren't that many women in law school, and they couldn't get jobs as lawyers when they got out. In fact, the only job offer she received, Sandra Day O'Connor, was as a legal secretary at Gibson, Dunn and Crutchner, a job she turned down. By the way, she told me how much she enjoyed giving a keynote address to an anniversary celebration of this same law firm years later, after she was on the bench. And she stood up in front of this black tie crowd and she said, "How sweet it is." She had a great sense of humor. In 1952, she was determined. She was determined that she was going to get a job, and she tackled this job hunt with the same determination and grit that the Lazy Bee Cowboys always intended for her to use on the ranch. When the county attorney for San Mateo County told her they lacked the funds for another attorney, she went back and wrote a letter listing all the things that she could do and the reasons why he should hire her. She offered to work for no salary if necessary. As a result, she was offered deputy county attorney. In 1954, 2 years later, Sandra and John moved to Frankfurt, Germany. He was in the military. And John served in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. Sandra was at his side as a civilian lawyer in the Quartermaster Corps. When they returned to the United States 3 years later, they settled in Phoenix, and John joined a big law firm there. Sandra started a neighborhood law office with a colleague as soon as she passed the bar. She eventually left the practice to raise her 3 sons. That's what women did. Ironically, it was during this time that she was focusing on her family, that she got involved in local politics, and ultimately how she ended up on the Supreme Court. From Assistant State Attorney General to Arizona State Senator in 1972, she became the first woman in the country to become majority leader in a state senate. In 1975, she returned to the judiciary and served as a trial judge on the Maricopa County Superior Court until 1979, when Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt appointed her to the Arizona Court of Appeals. That was 79. In 1981, President Reagan needed to appoint a replacement for retiring Justice Potter Stewart. And one of the campaign promises Reagan had made was that he would appoint a woman to the court. Believe it or not, there were not many conservative female judges to pick from back then. Then Associate Justice William Rehnquist, who had been her former beau at Stanford, introduced Reagan to Sandra Day O'Connor, and the rest is history. At her funeral in the Washington National Cathedral last December, Chief Justice Roberts, the former Department of Justice staffer on the team assigned to help her prep for her Senate confirmation hearing, eulogized Justice O'Connor, saying that her leadership shaped the legal profession, making it obvious that judges are both women and men. She was so successful that the barriers she broke down are almost unthinkable today, but not in her lifetime. Sandra O'Connor was an example of how to live life fully and completely. Immediately after moving to DC, she and John bought a house in Chevy Chase, Maryland. They joined the Chevy Chase Country Club and took golf and tennis lessons together. This is on top of all of her legal work. They were always the very best on the dance floor. They came to my daughter's wedding, and I got to dance with John, and it was just magic. Sandra and John were indefatigable. If there was a state dinner, a theater opening, or even a new panda at the zoo, Sandra O'Connor was there. She loved to fly fish, and John didn't. He wanted nothing to do with it. So she told me this story of flying to a small fishing camp in northern Alaska one Labor Day weekend after she had given a speech in Juneau. Labor Day is like winter in Alaska, as northern Alaska especially. It was the very end of the season, this tiny little fishing lodge. Sandra came down for breakfast the first morning to discover that she was the only woman around the table. And the men, of course, didn't believe who she was. When she introduced herself and she said, "Hi, I'm Sandra Day O'Connor," one of them went, "Sure, really." The bears, of course, didn't care who she was. And they were plentiful, which meant that she wouldn't be able to duck behind a tree if she had to go to the bathroom. So once she pulled on her high-waisted waders, she would have to keep them on until she returned at the end of the afternoon. So no coffee for breakfast. She also loved art. Supreme Court justices, as members of Congress also, can borrow art from any Washington museum to hang in their chambers. Sandra's chambers were full of photographs of the lazy bee, interspersed with the works of great American artists like Frederick Remington and Thomas Moran, both who specialized in painting scenes of the American West. There is a bronze sculpture of a horse on a table near her desk that was by Remington. We both selected a carving of an eagle to be included in her portrait. It was done by a Native American and given to her when the members of the tribe visited her chambers. She had a gift for drawing people together and an instinct for creating a community of people who ended up genuinely caring for each other. Each justice is allowed 2 secretaries and up to 4 clerks. And while every justice built an exceptional team of the best and the brightest from all the Ivies, Sandra's clerks were more. She looked for people who were special in other ways. She had opera singers, musicians, explorers, athletes. They were all brilliant lawyers. One year, she had a Vietnamese boat immigrant who worked his way through law school. He was a brilliant lawyer and a concert pianist. Really exceptional. She treated her clerks like family. She worked them like dogs. And sometimes cooked Southwestern dinners for them if they had to pull an all-nighter. From time to time, she asked me to take them to see a special exhibit at the National Gallery. It's, walking distance from the Supreme Court. She always took them every year to the tidal basin to see the cherry blossoms. I remember one year it had been a really wet spring, and apparently the desert in Arizona was in extraordinary bloom. She said she didn't ever remember it. She took all of her clerks to Arizona just to walk through the desert. But it wasn't just her clerks who were part of her very special community. She created one in our exercise class and also throughout the court, from the elevator operators to the runners in the marshal office to her colleagues on the bench. Sandra Day O'Connor started the custom of having lunch in the room where they debated on Fridays all the cases that they had been discussing all week. They went over their decisions. While she was incredibly deliberate about how she treated people, she never asked for any special treatment herself and wanted to be judged on her merits. From the moment she joined the court as the first female justice, Sandra wanted to ensure that she would not be the last. only 2 accommodations were made for her. The justices were no longer addressed on the bench as Mr. Justice. Instead, they became plain Justice. And the wives' dining room was renamed the spouses' dining room. In 1982, she drafted the majority opinion in the case that involved gender discrimination, Mississippi University for Women v. Hogan. A man had sued after being denied admission to the all-female nursing school, and the court ruled that the school must admit qualified men. A conservative jurist, Sandra was unpredictable. She was an unpredictable voter during her 2 decades on the bench. She frequently tried to be a majority builder, but was also the swing vote in many divisive cases, including Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the 1992 abortion case that reaffirmed Roe v. Wade. Whether the subject was affirmative action, states' rights, campaign finance, national security, or abortion, she had ideas that spoke for the court. During her time in Washington, her rulings often fell not to the right, but firmly in the center. Occasionally, she invited me to the court to listen to oral arguments. I don't know if any of you have ever participated. It's grand theater. And the handful of her opinions that I read, I found her writing to be not only brilliant, but elegant. Sandra never missed an oral argument during her tenure on the bench, not even when she had surgery for breast cancer or an appendectomy. When her husband, John, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, she continued to work. When he was in the early stages, she arranged for a group of male friends to have lunch with him every day. When the disease progressed and there's no longer practical just to take him out for lunch, he came to Sandra's chambers and sat there while she worked. And when he required constant care, she retired. Because for her, family always came first. But Sandra was as active in retirement as she had been while working. She spent time with her 6 grandchildren, taking them on trips. She wrote 2 children's books on her own colorful childhood, living on the Lazy Bee. And actually, I did a portrait of her first granddaughter, whose name was Courtney. My daughter's a Courtney too. And she spoke widely and often wrote about 2 causes that she was passionate about: judicial independence and civics education. She even started this children's game called iCivics when she discovered that a lot of school children couldn't name the 3 branches of government. I can only imagine what she would say about our judiciary and the Supreme Court specifically if she were still alive today. It's been a long time since I last saw her, but her lessons continue to influence my life. Pragmatism, hard work, resilience, and never asking for special treatment on one hand. Drawing people together, creating real community, prioritizing family, and living life fully and completely on the other. Right brain, left brain, always. Sandra often told me, make the best decision you can with the information you have, and don't look back. I think of that often. She made history and changed the world, but I'm very grateful for the way she changed me. Thank you. I know that there's some people in here who who know her or knew her or visited the court for hearing oral arguments. And if you have anything you would like to add about Sandra, I know you did the can-can with Sandra Day O'Connor. Maybe stand up. Oh, thank you. Anybody else have an experience with the court or with her that? I'll take just a couple more minutes to show you. This obviously is the portrait I was talking about. And I want to mention the frame because I use this fabulous framer in Washington who took architectural elements from the Supreme Court and applied them as decoration around the borders of the frame. And please, it's not even gold leaf, it's platinum leaf. It's just like, but she loved it. And can I, is this, whoops, no. Please. Did I?
You did it now.
Uh-oh. Well, you all are probably hot in here. Sorry. I'm going to let... I learned from my mistakes. So I just I just want to quickly show you some of the preparatory work that I did. You can see her ring that I talked about, but she also had these very long, slender fingers, elegant hand. There she is holding the Bible. And these are just some of the sketches that I made. Here's her chair. I wasn't quite sure, should she be seated firmly on it or balanced on one. This is sort of looking down. Then I decided, no, I wanted her to be bigger than. And this was just an informal, I did this and gave to her. And this is what we eventually used. You can see there's a slight tension. Her hand not quite touching the arm of the chair. And this is how I begin with underpainting. A lot of it is sort of my interpretation of a very classical way to paint with underpainting and glazes. I told you I wanted her warmth to come out, and I decided to emphasize that by all this black, which can be very harsh and very cold, to be as warm as possible. So I underpainted it with red. And then I started both putting glazes on and working the background. In those days, I wanted texture. I wanted to show paint as paint. I don't do that now. And no, that's, okay. This is a different eagle than the one I ended up using. And this was in my studio with photographs, and there's my paint. And this is, I had it completely painted in the portrait, took it out. Because the Native Americans were very important to her, and I wanted them represented in, oh, and these are some people from the exercise class. She gave a luncheon every year at the court for our exercise class. And these are just clippings from the newspaper after she died. Nancy Pelosi honoring both Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And here she is in state, in the Capitol. How old was she when you did the portrait? 60. She was 60 years old when she asked me to do the portrait. As I said, she thought she wasn't going to get any better looking.
Did you talk while you were working on the portrait?
Well,
Were you doing your work?
I was doing my work and she was talking, but I was listening. I find it really hard to chew gum and pat my head at the same time. And so if I talk, I have to put my brush down. And as you can imagine, her time is very valuable and limited. And I didn't want to drag things out. She would give me about an hour and a half for a sitting, and we staged them at different places. One time she brought John over to see the portrait as it was progressing, and he went, "Looks like a hanging judge to me." Any other questions or comments?
I have a question about her conservatism and her republicanism, and I know
About
her conservatism and her republicanism. I know she was involved in that pretty difficult decision about Gore versus Bush, the one with the hanging chats and all that, and she went with Bush as far as I know. And I wondered whether you heard about that. That could not have been a pleasant time for her. And I just wondered if she shared any of that with you.
That's when she said to me, "I make the best decision I can with the information I have at the time, and I don't look back." It's the only time I almost came out and asked her. I never asked her about her opinions and decisions. This time I just was heartbroken that she probably voted for Bush, but that was how she responded. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't go, we have something for you. I want to thank Annette for a really interesting portrait in so many ways of Justice O'Connor. And as is our tradition, we have a little something for her. I know that cherry trees are really big down in DC, but around here, sugar maples are a little bigger. And for that, we have a half-gallon of maple syrup for you.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you.
You did a great job. Thank you. So that concludes things for this evening. Again, we'll have a nice reception across the way. Please, everybody join us. I just want to let you know that next week we have Nora Lewis, who is from the Black History Trail New Hampshire organization. She's going to be talking about Amos Fortune and other early African Americans and their experience in New Hampshire. I think it should be quite interesting. So, thank you very much. We are now adjourned.